Brace yourself for the real horror I'm about to share. I'm not even sure if this is the right place to tell a story like this, but I can't think of anywhere else to talk about it, and honestly, I just need to get it out. I've told anyone who would listen, my family, my neighbors, my friends, random people online. It's never enough. I can't really explain why, but I feel this strange obligation to warn as many people as possible about what happened to me. So here I am, in November 2019, writing this down. The story began a long time ago, about 7 years earlier, maybe 2012 or 2013. I can't recall exactly. Back then I was in my mid-20s. I had a steady job and a girlfriend, who's now my fiancée. I never went to college, so I had been working for a while, and there was no reason to expect any major changes in my life. I didn't plan on moving away from home, so I didn't. My parents had generously passed down a brick house to me, my first home. It was extremely old, one my father had inherited from his grandparents when he was about 40. I wanted to keep it in the family. The place had seen a few renovations over the years, but you could still tell how old it was. The bricks gave it away. There weren't many brick houses in our area, so it stood out like a sore thumb. I actually liked that. It gave the place character. We lived in a heavily wooded neighborhood, with houses spaced far apart. Ours sat at the very end of the street, bordered by forest on two sides. The woods behind us were enormous, so big that when my brothers and I explored them as kids, we could never map the whole area. Some people might find that creepy, but I always loved the wilderness. I've always been a private person, happy to be tucked away in my own little corner of the world. That little patch of earth was our haven. My girlfriend and I had been living there for a few months when things started happening. It was sometime in winter, I don't remember the exact month, but there was snow on the ground. It was a Sunday morning, a little after 8, the only day of the week I could sleep in. I was heading to my truck to grab a cup of coffee, like I did every Sunday, when I noticed something strange by the driveway footprints in the snow. At first, I thought my girlfriend had gotten up early without me hearing and gone outside for some reason. But the more I looked, the less that made sense. The trail led from the woods, across the yard, through a gap in our fence, straight to the driver's side of my truck, and then right back into the woods. It didn't circle the house or go near the windows. Whoever it was had walked directly from the forest to my truck and then turned around. It was weird, so weird that I asked my girlfriend about it later that day, but she hadn't gone outside. I wish I could give you more details about that first time, but it's been years. I just remember that moment vividly. Then nothing happened again for nearly 2 years. The next event came the following winter. I remember it clearly because it was 2015, the year my Seahawks lost the Super Bowl to Tom Brady. I woke up one morning, walked outside, and instantly knew something was very wrong. Footprints were everywhere across the driveway, around every window, all over the yard. I'm usually calm under pressure, but I won't lie, I was shaken. I was running late for work, so I didn't have time to study them closely, but I didn't want to leave my girlfriend in danger. I ran around the property to make sure no one was hiding, but that's all I could do before I had to go. As I pulled out of the driveway, I texted her about what I'd seen so she wouldn't panic. When I got home that evening, she had her own discovery to show me. She led me to one of the trails and pointed down, saying it had been bothering her all day. At first I didn't get it, then it hit me. There were no shoe prints. Whoever made those tracks had been barefoot. Barefoot, in freezing weather. My girlfriend suggested maybe it was an animal, but the prints were clearly human, 2 feet, 5 toes each. We called my dad. He said he'd never seen anything like that in all the years he'd lived there. He told me to grab my rifle and try to track whoever it was. I didn't want to, but I knew it was my responsibility. My girlfriend wanted to call the police, but I knew it would be pointless. We had no proof of a crime, just footprints. I promised her I'd call the cops if I found anything in the woods. She agreed, reluctantly. Like I said, the forest was its own world. I waited until the sun began to set, slung the rifle over my shoulder, and followed the tracks. About 30 minutes in, something strange happened. The trail split in two. I froze. How was that even possible? Had the person doubled back to throw me off? Or worse, were there 2 of them out there? Until that moment, I'd assumed there was only one. The thought that there might be more sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold. I stood there for a while before deciding to head back. It was getting dark. On the walk home, I kept thinking about those footprints. If two people had tried to walk in each other's tracks, I would have noticed a mistake somewhere. It was too perfect. Maybe someone had walked backward from deep in the forest to make it look like there were two people. Or maybe one person had been carrying another on their back and got tired halfway through. I honestly don't know which explanation is worse. We called the police that night, but just as I expected, they said there wasn't much they could do without evidence of an actual crime. I told my girlfriend I'd go back out in the morning, but heavy snow fell overnight, covering everything. The tracks were gone. That was the last thing that happened that winter, and thankfully, for a few years after, life moved on. My girlfriend and I got engaged, and we focused on happier things. But if that had been the end, I wouldn't be writing this. What happened next took place less than a year ago, just after New Year's January of this year. One random morning, I woke up to find footprints everywhere on our property. All the old memories came rushing back. My fiancé collapsed onto the bed, asking if we'd ever escape this nightmare. I had no answer. This time was worse. There were tracks leading straight to my shed, and several tools were missing. God only knows what else they'd done. I was furious. I called my friend Theo, explained the situation, and asked for help. He's an outdoorsman and a far better hunter than I am. That's partly why I reached out to him. He agreed and drove over a few hours later. My fiancée was sick with worry, but I promised her Theo and I could handle it. We dressed warmly and packed gear, knowing we might be out there for hours. I wasn't as afraid of the dark this time because Theo had a high-end thermal scope for his AR-10 rifle. I'd never spent that kind of money on hunting equipment, so I would have been blind without him, but it was comforting to know at least one of us could see. I won't sugarcoat it, I was scared. At first, Theo and I talked as we hiked, but after 45 minutes, we fell silent. The weight of the situation hit us both at once. I remember praying I hadn't dragged Theo into something truly dangerous. I don't know how long we walked before the trail split. Again, two sets of barefoot tracks, deep and distinct, disappearing into the trees. The trail suddenly stopped. We turned back to the split, and Theo muttered that whoever left those footprints really didn't want to be followed. I didn't want to think about that, so we just kept moving quietly. I'm not exaggerating, there were at least 3 more dead ends that forced us to turn around, wasting precious daylight. I remember thinking how unbelievable it was that someone could walk backwards so perfectly that the footprints looked untouched, as if no one had ever stepped there twice. Let me tell you, that's not normal. Theo pointed out one possible upside. The dead ends might mean we were only following one person. Eventually, darkness began to fall. We had gone deep into the woods, far enough that I no longer recognized anything around us. The footprints hadn't split again for a long time. Then Theo said that whoever we were tracking had probably given up on making fake detours, and a few minutes later, the prints grew noticeably deeper. We were getting closer. That's when another set of prints appeared, right beside the first. Theo swore under his breath and whispered that he'd been wrong. We were following 2 people. The sun had fully set by then, so Theo had to keep checking his thermal scope. The snow gave me a little visibility, but to be honest, if it weren't for that scope, I probably would have turned back. We were walking in total silence when, out of nowhere, Theo's arm shot out across my chest, his signal to stop. He was staring straight ahead through his scope, completely still. I couldn't see what he was looking at, but his posture was rigid, like he was holding his breath. I'd never seen him that silent before. After about 20 seconds, he slowly crouched behind a nearby tree. I followed his lead without question. His hands began to tremble as he stared through the scope. Another 20 seconds of complete silence. The tension was unbearable. I tapped his shoulder gently. He lowered the rifle and silently handed it to me. I looked through the scope and had to choke back a scream. 4 figures huddled together in the snow. At first, I thought they were bears, but no, they were human. 2 of them were tall and hunched, the other 2 smaller. The smaller ones clung to a nearby tree, jerking their heads violently as they ate something. I couldn't make out their faces or details. The thermal scope doesn't show that, but I could see enough to know they weren't wearing clothes. That was, without question, the most terrifying thing I have ever seen with my own eyes. After a while, the larger figures lifted the smaller ones off the tree and placed them on their shoulders. Then they walked deeper into the forest and disappeared. Theo and I stayed crouched beneath that tree for what felt like an hour. We didn't dare move until we were absolutely sure those things were gone. By the time we got back home hours later, my fiancée was still awake. She said she hadn't been able to sleep knowing we were out there. She asked what we'd found, and I told her as little as possible. Even so, she was horrified. We called the police that night. They said they'd send a search team into the woods the next morning. Theo agreed to stay over so we could help guide them. The next day, officers joined us and searched for several hours, but they called it off once the footprints became too faint to follow. My fiancé begged them to continue, but they said they couldn't justify an extended search over a few missing tools. I don't blame them, but that wasn't the end. Theo and I knew what we saw. Winter was coming fast, and both my fiancé and I were terrified those things would come back. We seriously considered moving, but hadn't managed to make it happen yet. I honestly didn't know what to think anymore. I told everyone who would listen about what happened. None of my neighbors had ever experienced anything remotely like it. It didn't make sense. Why was our house the one being targeted? What did those things even want? Some friends told me they were harmless. Others said I was in serious danger. I decided to try sealing off my property from the woods, but beyond that, all I could do was hope we'd move soon. Last summer, I decided to clear my head by hiking a large section of the Pacific Crest Trail. I've always loved hiking, especially solo trips. My plan was simple: park my truck at the endpoint, hitch a ride to the trailhead, and walk back over the course of about 10 days. It sounded peaceful. For the first few days, everything went perfectly. The trail was exactly what I'd hoped for. Long stretches of winding paths beneath towering trees, surrounded by still, quiet landscapes. I was in decent shape, so I didn't need to rest often. Of course, I never hiked at night. Each evening, I'd step a little off the main trail to set up camp far enough to stay hidden, since solo hikers can attract unwanted attention. I'd pitch my tent, eat a quick meal, and get some sleep. Everything was fine until the third night. What I'm about to tell you is the reason I stopped hiking and stopped exploring the wilderness altogether for a very long time. I woke up in the middle of the night with that deep, primal feeling that something was wrong. You can't explain it, but you know. I looked around my tent. Everything seemed normal inside, so I grabbed my rifle, my flashlight, and stepped out. No one was there. At least, no one I could see. I went back inside and started checking my gear. That's when I noticed my wallet was gone. At first, I thought maybe I just misplaced it, left it outside, or buried it in my pack, but after tearing everything apart, it was obvious. Someone had taken it. My ID, my cash, my credit cards gone. Why just that? Sure, it was possible someone had slipped into my tent, stolen the wallet, and left, but that seemed impossible in the middle of nowhere, and losing it randomly just wasn't like me. Reluctantly, I convinced myself I must have dropped it somewhere. But over the next few days, more things went missing. Small items, random stuff, one of my lighters, my Swiss Army knife, a few energy bars. I knew then I wasn't just losing things. Someone was taking them. I wanted to believe it was all in my head, but by the fourth day, I couldn't deny it anymore. I was being followed. There was no cell service along that stretch of the trail, so I couldn't warn anyone or call for help. I remember thinking about turning back, but at best, I would only save a couple of days. There was no way I could hike in either direction without stopping to sleep, and the idea of pitching my tent in the woods while someone was stalking me felt like a death wish. I tried to stay calm and reminded myself that there was a reason I'd brought my rifle out there. Then it hit me. Why hadn't whoever was following me taken it already? It was almost as if they were taunting me. That night, I tied my tent shut from the inside, hoping it would keep them out if they returned. I stayed awake as long as I could, but eventually exhaustion took over. When I woke up the next morning, the tent was undisturbed, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been near. Still, the paranoia had taken hold. Solitude was starting to eat away at my sanity. Every step felt heavier. I've never been an anxious person, but I've never felt worse in my entire life than I did during those next few days. Imagine being in my situation, no choice but to keep walking, knowing that someone, somewhere, might be following you. The dread was constant. My mind was breaking down. I can't explain how or why, but my brain started playing tricks on me. A rustle in the bushes, nothing there. A shadow at the edge of my vision gone the instant I turned. Then came the hallucinations. The most vivid one happened while I was walking. I suddenly stepped into what felt like ankle-deep water. I even heard the splash plunk and felt the icy chill soaking my boots. But when I looked down, the ground was completely dry. I just stood there, frozen. It had felt so real that my only option was to keep walking, pretending it hadn't happened. Daytime was no better than night. Every evening I tied my tent tightly and slept beside my rifle, but nothing eased the fear. Once, I splashed cold water on my face just to stay grounded. The hallucinations finally started to fade, but then came the footsteps. That night, I woke up to the sound of someone walking circles around my campsite. I grabbed my rifle, ready to confront whoever it was, but I couldn't move. My body locked up with fear. After a few minutes, the footsteps drifted away into the forest. I didn't sleep again. As soon as the sun came up, I tore down my camp. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely tie the straps on my pack. I couldn't spend another night out there. I was close now, maybe a day and a half from my truck, maybe less if I pushed hard. So I made a decision. I wouldn't stop again. I'd hike through the night if I had to. I just needed to get off that damn trail. I walked for hours, as fast as my legs would go. When the sun set, I clenched my teeth and kept moving, instead of setting up camp. By the time it was pitch black, I was almost there, maybe 2 hours away at most. I kept hiking, one hand gripping the flashlight, the other holding my rifle. Then I started to question my plan. I'd never hiked at night before. I hadn't realized how terrifying it could be, how every sound echoes, how every shadow feels alive. The fear itself was exhausting. Still, I kept my breathing steady and moved forward. About an hour later, I heard footsteps behind me. I stopped, listened. There it was again. I spun around and aimed my flashlight. Something was there. My heart jumped. I saw movement behind a tree. My pulse exploded with adrenaline. I raised my rifle, shouting for them to come out. And then, they did. A figure stepped into the beam of my light. Definitely human, but when I say it was the most horrifying thing I've ever seen, I'm not exaggerating. Words don't do it justice. He was wearing nothing but my shorts, a pair I hadn't even realized was missing. His skin was scraped and filthy, his face covered in tangled hair, and he started walking toward me. Instinct took over. Before I could even think, I fired a warning shot into the ground beside him. The blast echoed through the forest. He flinched, then bolted, sprinting into the darkness. I didn't wait. I turned and ran as fast as I could until I burst out of the woods. I locked myself in my truck and called the police. When they finally arrived, they told me not to stay there any longer. They didn't have to tell me twice. I drove away that night and never looked back. Honestly, the hallucinations were almost as terrifying as the man himself. I never thought such vivid, realistic visions were even possible. It'll be a long, long time before I go hiking again, and when I do, I sure as hell won't be going alone. If anyone reading this plans to hike the Pacific Crest Trail, be extremely careful and bring a weapon. This is an experience that still haunts me. Whenever they switched radio channels, the voices followed. And the farther up the mountain they went, the clearer those voices became. They couldn't make out full conversations, but from what they did hear, both men agreed the tone was wrong. My friend's dad said sometimes the voices almost sounded normal, but the words didn't make sense, like fragments of conversations that didn't belong together. Then they started finding strange signs that someone had been there before them. Random containers, footprints in the dirt, and small makeshift campsites. As I said earlier, this place was incredibly remote, almost unreachable, so those discoveries were deeply unsettling. No one was supposed to be up there. One day, Griffin stumbled upon a tent hidden just off the trail and called my friend's dad over. They decided to check it out. Inside, they found a sleeping bag and a rough canvas sack filled with some of the most disturbing things you could imagine. Several pairs of children's underwear, duct tape, rope, and crude hand-drawn sketches of abused kids. There was even a fresh apple inside, meaning whoever owned it had been there recently. Griffin wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but my friend's dad, ever the workaholic, insisted they finish their job. They agreed to only contact each other over the radio in case of emergency and kept working. That night, they sat inside their camper truck, unable to shake the creeping dread that had settled over them. Then the radio crackled again. This time, they could clearly hear two male voices talking, discussing ordinary things like fetching water and gathering firewood. But they realized, with growing horror, that the men they were hearing were likely the same ones connected to that hidden tent. Griffin stayed calm, but my friend's dad began to panic. The following night, when the voices mentioned gathering brush for a fire, my friend's dad grabbed the radio and demanded to know who they were and what they were doing out there. Instant silence. No response. The static hissed and then died completely. That silence was somehow worse than the voices. Griffin was furious that my friend's dad had revealed their presence, and the two argued for a while before deciding they'd confront the situation in the morning. Around midnight, Griffin shook him awake. "There's someone outside," he whispered. The first thing my friend's dad noticed was the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel, then a sudden thump against the side of the camper. He scrambled for his gun, only to realize the magazine was missing. He had no idea where his bullets had gone. Griffin didn't have a weapon, and calling the police was laughable given how far they were from civilization. They both sat frozen as the camper's door handle began to rattle. The door creaked open slightly, but didn't swing inward. Their camper sat high off the ground, and there was no ladder or stool outside. Then came the scraping, long, deliberate scratches down the metal door. 4 agonizing minutes passed. Finally, my friend's dad nodded to Griffin, signaling that he was going to check it out. He crept toward the door, flashlight trembling in his hand. Just as he reached for the handle, the door burst open. He was slashed across the face with a knife. The pain blinded him. He fell backward out of the camper and hit the ground hard. Before he could recover, a man was on top of him, pressing the knife to his throat. Another man appeared and began kicking him in the head. Griffin didn't hesitate. He leapt from the camper, tackled the attacker with the knife, and wrestled him to the ground. The second man bolted into the darkness, and the one Griffin fought soon broke free and ran after him. Both vanished into the trees. Griffin helped my friend's dad back into the truck, and they drove 2 hours to the nearest hospital. His face was a mess, bloody, torn, and a deep slash across his right eye permanently damaged his vision. They reported the attack to the police, but nothing ever came of it. 2 weeks later, after the rest of the logging crew finished the job, one of their co-workers was found tied up, gagged, raped, and murdered in a nearby ditch. To this day, no one has ever been arrested. My friend's father now suffers from severe PTSD. His right eye, with its misshapen pupil, is a constant reminder of that night. I doubt he's had a single good night's sleep since. For years, I was terrified of the deep woods, mainly because of what happened to him. I haven't heard from my friend or his father in years. All I can do is hope they're still alive and safe.